All right, today we're going to talk about the end of Manifest Destiny, the slide to Civil War. After the Mexican War, if you guys watched the lectures from this past week, you know, we finished up the Mexican War. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave us this huge chunk of land that we are out here. I'm going to get to the map and I'll show you. So the war with Mexico gave us this big piece of land, which we call the Mexican Cession. It gave us Texas, okay, which we annexed. And actually this little chunk of land right over here because we set the boundary at the Rio Grande, remember? So we've gotten everything from California to New Mexico to Texas. All of this is considered Mexican cession lands. Okay, you draw the boundary up here, and you guys know that that's the Louisiana Purchase, the remnants of the Louisiana Purchase, and then of course that's the Oregon country over there. So we've really, by the end of the Mexican War, we have fulfilled what we kind of talked about, right? Dominating this part of the continent. Okay, now that seems great. Okay, that seems great. And it is, okay? By warfare, by negotiation, whatever, we have gained all of this territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But it's come at a cost, okay? As you guys can tell. Look at the 1848 election. Right after the Mexican War ends, we're going to have an election. One of the heroes of the Mexican War, Zachary Taylor, is going to be elected president. Okay, so Zachary Taylor will be nominated and will be elected president by the Whigs. But if you look at his opponents, you start to see what the big problem is. Okay, and it is a big problem. Okay, the two of Taylor's opponents, Lewis Cass and Martin Van Buren, both of them during the campaign really have to make a stand on slavery. Okay, and it's not the existence of slavery per se, but the expansion of slavery into this territory. And that has become the hang-up. What do we do about slavery expanding into these new territories? I told you guys it was never, when this gets going, really about where slavery already exists. That's a minor argument until you get later on. But it was always, do we allow slavery to expand? And that is going to be our big hang-up, okay? The election of 1848 is really one of the first times that you see that happen, okay? You see some of these sides that show up and have to make a stand. At the bottom down there, you see Martin Van Buren. Everybody see him? Former President Martin Van Buren, who will run as a third-party candidate for the Free Soil Party. And I told you guys that ought to give you a clue, okay? Free Soilers are a mixture of former third-party members like the Liberty Party. Back in 1840, James D. Birney had run as a third-party candidate for the Liberty Party and opposed the expansion of slavery. The Martin Van Buren will become one of the leaders of this. Remember, he is from New York. And so New York is a free state. And so you can see why he will be attracted to the Free Soil Party. Okay. In contrast to Van Buren, you've got Zachary Taylor, who's a slaveholder. Okay. So you have one of the presidential candidates who is a slaveholder, okay, with his vice presidential candidate, Millard Fillmore, who is a New York lawyer. And they're going to ride really ride Taylor's history, or Taylor's war record, to get him elected, okay? Now, in the middle is the Democratic candidate, Lewis Cass, okay? Lewis Cass also will take a stand on slavery. The Democrats are going to hang their coattails on allowing slavery to expand into the new territories as long as the people want it to. Meaning, Lewis Cass is going to develop a theory or an idea called popular sovereignty. When a territory out here in these new territories gets ready to apply for statehood, then they should have the right, not Congress, they should have the right to determine whether or not they want to be slave or free. So all of this area that you see up here, when those territories get ready to come in, they should have a choice. And Cass is going to call that popular sovereignty. Allow the people to decide. Okay? Oh boy. If you look at the 1848 election, you can see the Americas becoming a little bit more divided. The House is almost dead divided between Democrats and Whigs. There is bitter factionalism between not only parties, but also locations, north and south, south and west, west and north. Okay, sectionalism is well entrenched. These slavery theories are starting to force people to take sides. Okay, they are really kind of forcing a lot of these delegates to figure out where they stand. The time for being wishy-washy is pretty much coming to an end. I'll give you an example, okay? Things like the Talmadge Amendment, the Wilmot Proviso, those things that have kind of scared Southerners to death, have forced many of them to make a choice. And so, if you look at the debates from this time, as we're starting to try to decide what we're going to do about slavery in these new territories, some major, theories emerge, okay, if you want to think of it, or solutions emerge. All right, number one, no slavery in the new territories. That's the Free Soil Party, okay? No slavery in the new territories. That's what the Liberty Party had run on in 1840. It's what the Free Soil Party will run on in 1848. Slavery is fine where it already exists, but it will not be allowed to expand into any of the new territories. There is also the no slavery anywhere, period, idea. That's the abolitionist stance. That is, in 1848, that's an extreme view, believe it or not. It's actually kind of considered to be radical in 1848. Today, we don't, of course, find that very radical. Okay, but in 1848, it was. That was radical abolitionism like William Lloyd Garrison, who I introduced you to over the weekend, if you watched that. Garrison and other abolitionists demanded immediate abolition of slavery, immediate emancipation of slaves wherever they were. No compensation for the owners. Slavery was immoral and should be removed everywhere. That's the radical stance. Not allowing slavery to expand in the territories was a much more moderate stance. And that's the free soil stance. This is also going to be the idea that's going to be incorporated into the new Republican Party when it emerges. So keep that in mind. The other theories that all espoused really allowing slavery to expand in one way or another. There was Lewis Cass's popular sovereignty, let the people decide. There were some that believed, look, let's just go back to the Missouri Compromise and draw the Missouri Compromise line out to the Pacific. Anything below the line could have slavery, anything above the line cannot. That was one proposal. Not very popular, but it did seem to be the least controversial one because we already have a settlement on record, right? So let's just go back to it. And then there is the radical, extreme Southern view of allowing slavery anywhere, at any time, even on free territory. This is John C. Calhoun's view. In the years since John C. Calhoun left the federal government, he had returned back to South Carolina and become really an extreme states writer and an extreme proponent for slavery and slavery's expansion. Calhoun wanted to see slaves should be able to be taken anywhere. Okay? Now, that's 5 major theories. You can see why they've become so controversial. And I told you guys that all we needed was a spark to get it going, and we get it. It's California. California, because of the gold rush in 1849, because of the massive amounts of people that began to move to California, they are ready for statehood much faster than anybody really thought they could be. Okay? And as the California issue starts to fan the flames a little bit, I want you to know that there are other things that are going on at that time that show just how divided the country was. Okay? 1, there was a movement underway by 1850 to ban the slave trade in the nation's capital. Even in 1850, because the nation's capital was in slave territory, Virginia and Maryland still allowed slaves, there were slave markets in the nation's capital. And so there was a movement underway to ban the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Calhoun and other Southern delegates, about 69 or so Southern delegates to Congress, began to take steps to oppose that. In it, a lot of these, they started talking about Northern aggression towards slavery, the ruining of, or the attempted ruination of the Southern economy. So, they also began to complain and according to the nation's laws at that time, they have a real legitimate beef. I'm not saying it's a moral, ignore the moral question for right now, okay? But according to the laws of the land, Southerners complained that not only was the federal government, but also many state governments were not abiding by the Constitution and returning runaway slaves, so-called fugitive slaves. Slaves were property. And if you view them as property, okay, then property must be returned to its original owner. If I left today after class and bought a Corvette, and one of you scoundrels stole it and drove it to Maine, okay, and then across the border and got into Canada and got away. But you left my Corvette in Maine. What does Maine have to do? Yes, Maine has to return my property, okay? So once they are through with their investigation of which one of you scofflaws stole my car, okay, they have to return it because it's property. But when you cross the line into a human being, that becomes a little bit more difficult. And we talked about, and I talked about in the lecture about the Underground Railroad, that there were organizations that were in the North that were actively seeking to help slaves escape the South and make it to free territory, Canada if they had to escape the evils of slavery. Well, you can pretty much guess that kind of flies in the face of any fugitive slave law, right? So, and they do. If you view the Constitution, you view the laws that are already on the books, they have a legitimate beef. All right. Then you get California. California gets ready to apply for territorial status. Because of the 1849 gold rush, it has people that are pouring in there. And it really has the potential to not only bypass really the territorial status, but just to go right straight to statehood. Before Polk left office, he didn't do anything about organizing California or New Mexico into territories. Okay? Mainly because of slavery. And now, all of a sudden, you've got California who is ready to apply for statehood almost, and they've never really even been organized into a territory, much less a state. And Taylor now has to face this question: what are we going to do about California? He pretty much sends a note to California and New Mexico and tells them not to wait on Congress, but to determine for yourselves how you want to enter the Union, which makes it sound like he's kind of supporting the popular sovereignty idea, right? Even though that's not his party's stance at that moment. He pretty much tells them, hey, go ahead and organize whichever way you think. California, of course, will draft a state constitution that will make California enter the nation as a free state, which of course makes the South furious. But Taylor recommends admitting California immediately. So in March of 1850, California applies for statehood as the 31st state, which will upset the balance of power between slave and free states. And that is going to cause a massive issue. Okay? All right. So our buddy Taylor here has to decide. He says apply, and they do. And California is ready to enter the Union as a free state. Okay? So there's California. You guys know what's going to happen there, okay? All because of the gold rush. So California gets ready to expand, okay? Would have helped if I would have gotten into the right one. All right, here we go. All right. So let's kind of remind ourselves, okay, what's kind of going on here, okay? California has applied for statehood. It's threatening to upset the balance of power. Southern states, including those that Calhoun has under his wing, start to threaten leaving the Union. Secession has reared its ugly head again. Okay? So, look, I told you guys they kind of have a legitimate complaint, okay, that the Underground Railroad and fugitive slave laws aren't being enforced. So these very ultra radical Southerners, including Calhoun and others, start to toy with the idea of leaving the Union. It's not popular yet, but it's out there. In 1850, there is a great need for a compromise, and our friend Henry Clay is going to come through one more time and is going to orchestrate a group of bills together that will become known as the Compromise of 1850. There was a lot of discussion that if this doesn't get done, the Union is going to break apart. The Union has begun to fray at the seams, all because of slavery. And we need something to stitch the Union back together, if nothing but temporarily. And Clay is going to rise to the occasion one more time. I wish that we had things like C-SPAN in 1850 where you could have watched what happened. Everybody that talks about the debates over the Compromise of 1850 will tell you that it was some of the highest drama ever in the halls of Congress and in the Senate. It may be, and still may be, the most intense debate in American history. So Clay, along with really Daniel Webster, some help from Stephen A. Douglas, are going to propose a compromise that will become labeled the Compromise of 1850. Clay has a horrific job on his hands, okay? Because guys like Calhoun, okay, they are entrenched in this idea about the fugitive slave law. They wanted California either not to come into the Union or because it could be below the 3630 line, okay, they wanted to come in as a slave state. And they had started to threaten to secede from the Union all over California statehood. Okay? Calhoun and others had even floated ideas like, if we do, we should have two separate Americas. One slave, one free. Two presidents. Okay, one from the north and one from the south. Just terrifying. Daniel Webster from the north, from Massachusetts, takes the unionist approach. Secession is impossible. We can't split the land. We can't split the military. So we need a compromise at all costs. And Clay will be the architect of that compromise. Calhoun was very ill during the debates of compromise, over the Compromise of 1850. He was very ill. He was dying. And in order to see the debates, they basically had to carry him on a stretcher into the chamber and then kind of prop him up so that he could watch the debates. He was too weak to even give his own speech. And so he had somebody read his speech for him, and he sat up there on the dais and just glared at everybody. It is high drama. And had Clay failed, the Civil War may have started in 1850. And of course, may have turned out different. But Clay is going to try to tack about 4 or 5 things together. And when he does, he will preserve the Union at least for another 10 years before the Civil War begins. Okay? All right. Number 1. Clay believed that California must come into the Union as a free state because that's what they chose. Okay? So California will enter the nation as a free state. Okay? Everybody see that? Number 2, Utah and New Mexico will decide for themselves whether or not they will come in as slave or free. That's popular sovereignty. And so to deal with the territories, Clay says, number 1, California comes in as a free state. It's what they chose. Number 2, Utah and New Mexico will decide for themselves. That's popular sovereignty. Number 3, the trading of slaves, but not slavery. The trading of slaves, the closing of the slave markets will take place in Washington, D.C. In other words, selling, marketing, buying of slaves in Washington, D.C. is banned. Slavery is not outlawed, but the buying and selling of slaves is. All right, if you look at those first 3, it looks like the South didn't get anything, right? I mean, in fact, they're the big losers, it looks like, right? California is going to come in as a free state, which means the balance of power is going to be upset. Utah and New Mexico get to decide for themselves. That's popular sovereignty. They could lose there, okay? They've lost the ability to buy and sell slaves in Washington, D.C., which is minor, but it still is a limitation on slavery. And so to appease the South, Clay proposes a stricter fugitive slave law, recognizing the South and the South's complaints. Clay proposes a very strict and very enforceable fugitive slave law. All right. So now you're starting to see this come together. So far, the Compromise of 1850 is those 4 things. California comes in as a free state. Utah and New Mexico decide for themselves about popular sovereignty. Trading of slaves is outlawed in Washington, D.C. A stricter fugitive slave law to appease the South. Okay? Now, one of the architects, okay, and one of the supporters of popular sovereignty is not only Lewis Cass, but also this guy. You need to get familiar with him. His name is Stephen A. Douglas. He is a senator from the state of Illinois. He is a proponent of popular sovereignty and is a big kind of cog, if you will, in the Compromise of 1850 debates. Douglas is considering a run for president, and he will very soon enter the presidential arena. Trust me. Popular sovereignty is what they feel like or they hope will get them out of this mess, okay? And so, like Clay, Douglas felt like what they had proposed so far, California coming in as a free state, a stricter fugitive slave law, stopping the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and popular sovereignty in New Mexico would be enough, okay? This is what they proposed, and this is what they believe would get us through. So, when you kind of look at what had happened. Remember, in 1820, it took the Missouri Compromise to bring in Maine and Missouri to keep the balance of power. Now, okay, you've seen a couple of more come in that have kept the balance of power, okay, all the way until we get to right here. And California is going to upset it, okay? So California is going to give free states an advantage. The South, though, is going to hang its hat on the fugitive slave law, okay? And they believe that that would help their situation. All right. So, this is kind of what, if you look at it, this is geographically kind of what happens, okay? California becomes free. Utah and New Mexico get to choose by popular sovereignty, okay? Slave trade ends in Washington, D.C., and the fugitive slave law is passed. All right. This is actually rounded up in separate bills, lumped together and called the Omnibus Bill. Okay? So the Omnibus Bill goes through Congress, is passed, okay? And then it heads to the president. The most controversial part of it is this, the fugitive slave law. Under the new fugitive slave law, slaveholders or agents could seize a slave in the North and return it, which is what property would do, right? Slaves are not entitled to a trial by jury. Federal marshals could help in the recapture of slaves. There were fines for anyone who was found helping slaves. Now, you contrast that with what some northern states had already done. Some had already passed what were called personal liberty laws. And you can see the difference. Some northern states forbid state officials from assisting in captures of runaway slaves. And so, if there is one thing that stirs the pot and gives a jolt to the abolitionist movement, it's this. I told you guys that up until a point, really, radical abolitionism were the words that went together. A lot of people didn't believe that abolitionism was the way to go. The South had had some success, and I told you guys about this in the lecture, that some in the South had created really this myth about the way slaves were treated. This positive good idea that they were taken care of, they were fed. Yes, they had to work, but they were fed, they had homes, they had good lives, and if we had put them back in Africa, that their lives would be much worse. The fugitive slave law is going to put people into a moral dilemma, okay? I want you to think about that. No matter what your feelings about slavery are, if you're in the North, you're in Wisconsin, and a runaway slave happens upon your property, you have to make a personal decision. If you help that slave, you are breaking the law. If you return that slave, you're committing really a moral evil, right? And so, rather than put themselves in this continuing pickle, many began to turn to abolitionism, especially when some of the evils of slavery and the treatment of the way slaves were treated, when the reality of that began to hit home and began to be publicized, then that will drive many into the abolitionist camp. And abolitionism is going to become a force. There are a lot of people, there are a lot of historians that argue that the fugitive slave law, the insistence on a very harsh, very tough, very bitter fugitive slave law is a disaster for the South. They were always, it seemed, going to lose the balance of power. But insisting on this very angry fugitive slave law is perhaps what drives the final wedge. So, many in the North were infuriated by it, okay? And many in the North decided that many states passed those personal liberty laws and said, look, we're just not going to abide by it, which infuriates the South, right? Think about it. They've gone about this the way that they thought was right, and now they feel like the northern states are the ones that aren't upholding the Constitution. And so they began to drift apart. And it was hoped that the Compromise of 1850 was going to solve that. All right, here's the problem. They work it through Congress. They get it all the way through Congress. They work up all the details. They, by some miracle, get it passed through both houses of the Congress. And it goes to Taylor's desk. It goes to the president's desk. And he announces that he is going to veto it, which would have been a disaster. If he vetoes it, all of that work is for naught, and they don't really have the votes to overturn the veto. And so as this bill is working its way through Congress and getting ready to go to the president's desk for his signature, he makes it pretty clear that he's going to veto it, which would have been a total disaster. But before that can happen, Zachary Taylor dies in office. And so after his death, he will be replaced by his vice president, Millard Fillmore. And thankfully, Millard Fillmore says that he will sign it. So the bill goes to his desk, and one of the first things that Millard Fillmore does as president is sign the omnibus bill, which essentially creates the Compromise of 1850. All right, this saves the Union for about 10 more years. But there are people involved in this that they are, I won't call them bad actors, but they are, they're going to complicate things, okay? One is this guy. We'll go back a second. One is Douglas. When we talk about Stephen A. Douglas, in 4 short years from now, Stephen A. Douglas is going to be the author of something that, for really, in many ways, is the cause of the Civil War. One of the causes of the Civil War. And some of the first battles of the Civil War take place in the area that Douglas singles out. Because in 1854, he is going to be one of the architects of an act that comes out of Congress called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is going to organize Kansas and Nebraska into territories. You go to the map here, okay? See this unorganized territory right here? Well, let me go over here. It's a bigger map. There we go. See this unorganized territory right here? That's all Louisiana Purchase lands, right? Well, if you guys know a little bit of geography, please tell me you know a little bit of geography, okay? What state is right there? Kansas, thank God. Okay, which one is right up here? Nebraska is right to the north of it, right? Geographically challenged people. I ought to put a map on the final just to mess with your minds, okay? Kansas and Nebraska are right there, okay? They aren't even organized in 1850 as territories. But Stephen A. Douglas is going to push that through, try to get them organized as territories, allow them the choice of popular sovereignty, because what he wants to do, remember, he's from where? He's from Illinois. So what he wants is a northern route for the Transcontinental Railroad that would go through his state. And he's afraid that if they chose the southern route and go this way, it's going to bypass his state. So he wants Kansas and Nebraska organized so that they can take this more northerly route and it'll be beneficial for Illinois. But when you open up Kansas to popular sovereignty, the Southerners see an opportunity because Kansas is right here. Missouri is right there. And many Southerners believe that cotton can be grown in Kansas. And if they can just get Kansas to pass a state constitution and come into the Union as a slave state, then what? They've got one more slave state. And all hell is going to break loose because of it. A war in Kansas will break out, all because of the expansion of slavery and because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So Stephen A. Douglas, even though he is part hero here, is certainly going to be part villain a little bit later on when we talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We now kind of slide to the election of 1850, okay? And we're going to come back to that. Or the election of we get to the election of 1852, sorry. There's Winfield Scott, who is one of the heroes of the Mexican War. John Parker Hale, who is the Free Soil candidate. So the Free Soilers are still here in 1852. But the Democrats are going to win. Franklin Pierce will be nominated and then will win the presidency in 1852. And poor Pierce is going to watch the world come tumbling down around him, as several things are going to happen almost lightning quick that put us on a square footing towards the Civil War. Uncle Tom's Cabin will be published. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to happen. And all of a sudden, we are on the verge of civil war. All right, we'll talk about that next time, or you'll see that in the next lecture. Okay. All right, see you guys. Pay attention now over the next couple of days as we get ready. All right, so I'll let you guys know when that test comes up, and we'll be ready to move on. Okay. Y'all stay safe.